Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. How is it possibly this hot in October? I mean, if I keel over, can someone just do me a favour and put a cold towel on my face or something, and I'll probably come back round. Maybe there's something in this global warming stuff after all, hey? But it's really good to be with you this morning, and we're going to be continuing to explore this idea of transition, which we've been studying for the last few weeks. And it was a topic that was very deliberately chosen by the preaching team, because clearly we as a church, for those of you that come here regularly, you'll know that we are very much in a period of transition at the moment. Partly physically, at the end of this year, this calendar year, our lease is up here in this building, so we are actually actively looking for a new venue right now to hold Sunday church in. But more than that, I think God's been speaking, in a number of different ways over the past few weeks around this idea of transition, and how we as a church need to be prepared to look and feel different to maybe how we look and feel now, in order to be in the place that He wants us to be, which is a place where we can grow and where we can have a bigger impact on the communities around us. And to further supplement that, Beth brought a word a couple of weeks ago, which Marcus alluded to earlier on, which was this idea of moving from the sanctuary and to the stable. So from the place where things are comfortable and where we know how everything works, and maybe to a grittier, dirtier, harder place in order to have that bigger impact on the community. So this word transition feels like a really fitting one for where we are kind of as a church right now in this place. But I think it's an interesting word, and it's a word that possibly kind of raises different emotions in different people, because the word transition has connotations with changing and moving and altering. But I think in many cases, the word can actually be tinged with sadness. So I work for a headhunting firm, and when somebody tells me they are in a period of transition, it normally means they've lost their job, and they're in the period of transitioning into another job. I've also heard the word used when somebody is, in a place where their relationship is broken up, and they're transitioning from a place of being in a couple back to single life again. So again, kind of tinged with sadness. In other ways, transition can be really exciting and really positive. So when you get that promotion that you've always wanted, and you start to transition into the new role, that's really exciting. When you're transitioning from single life into married life, like I am right now, it's really exciting. It can be stressful as well, but on the whole, it's really exciting. So transition's quite ambiguous, and actually, based on how you interpret that word, it could provoke different emotions in you, is what I'm trying to say. But what I've pondered over the last few weeks, as I've considered this idea of transition, is that whether we see transition as positive or negative based on the situation that we might find ourselves in, the thing that we can't ever argue with is the importance of times of transition. When you lose your job and you have to transition into something else, and you're kind of evaluating what's happened and you're replanning for the future, that's a really pivotal time in your life. It's a really important time. When a girlfriend and boyfriend break up, probably because they weren't right for each other anyway, that period of assessing kind of what went wrong and what wasn't right, and therefore what needs to be there in the future, is actually a really vital time in those people's lives if they're ever going to find real happiness in a relationship. Likewise, if you do get that promotion and you're going through that transition period and you're learning about what's expected of you in the new role, again, it's really vital that that transition period goes well so that you're set up for success in the new role. And so for me, I really feel like us as a church now in this place of transition, we could easily feel like we're kind of coasting right now because there's a lack of clarity about maybe exactly what comes next. But if we really want to end up in the right place, this period that we're in right now is super important. And what we do in this period is really vital. And I've got one further analogy to try and get this point across. So I've recently taken up golf, which is a sport I told myself I would never play until I was physically too old to do anything else, because that's what I thought it was. I thought it was an old man's game. So maybe that means I'm now an old man. I don't know. But I've taken up golf recently, and I'm learning that every bit of advice that I had about playing golf has become true. So it is the most frustrating game in the world. It is a real fine art, and because of that, I decided that I would work with a coach who could help me with my development, and that's been really good. But one of the best bits of advice he's given me so far, and I don't think he realised quite how profound I thought this was, is that when you are doing a golf swing, the most critical part of that swing is the transition phase. So you bring your club up and you end up at point A, and it's actually as you move that club through the swing and your body moves and alters and the weight shifts through that swing, that transition period is kind of what makes or breaks your shot. And actually, the thing that I thought was quite poignant is, if you are a reasonably okay golfer, and I just about now put myself roughly in that category, if you are an okay golfer and you do a bad swing, i.e. you have a really bad transition, if you're an okay golfer, then the ball is still probably going to go from point A roughly towards where you want it to go. You might scuff it a bit, you might slice it a little bit, but it's going to end up down that way somewhere. And maybe you're happy with that. And I know a lot of people that are happy with that level of golf. But if actually you want to get from where you are now in point A and you want to get that ball to the perfect place down in the middle of the fairway, a few hundred yards in that direction, that transition period has to be right in order to set you up for that end product. And what I felt was, for us as a church, that's quite poignant, because if we as a church just want to go from where we are today and we want to end up somewhere in the right direction down there, then actually maybe what we do right now isn't that important. And maybe because we're a church and because God likes church, maybe we'll end up roughly in the right direction if we kind of go through the motions. But if we really want to end up in the perfect place that God has for us, where we can have the biggest impact on our communities, and we can really be in a place where this church can grow powerfully in the coming years, then what we do right now is important. And how we approach this transition period is important. The attitude we choose, the conversations we enter into, the prayer that we put into where we are right now as a church is all really, really important. And for a few minutes this morning, what I want to explore is kind of what it means to be faithful in that transition time. And that means what it means to be committed and to be constant to what God is calling us to during maybe some discomfort and some trial and some change. And I want to do this morning by looking at somebody in the Bible, a man named Noah, who we find in the Old Testament. And we find the account of Noah in the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis, between chapters 6 and 9. And if you attend church regularly, you'll probably know the story of Noah. If you don't attend church regularly, you may have heard reference to Noah and his ark in a secular perspective. But if that's the case, then don't worry, because I'm going to set the context here anyway. So in the book of Genesis, we read at the start about how God creates the earth and he creates the heavens, and he creates the first two human beings in Adam and Eve. And we read about how Adam and Eve disobey God in the perfect paradise of the Garden of Eden that he's created for them. And therefore they're thrown out of the garden, and they have to begin to populate the world outside of that perfection. And so they start to do that, and then as we get to chapter 5 of Genesis, we read about the whole lineage from Adam and Eve right through to Noah, who we're exploring this morning. And then by the time we get to chapter 6, and we read the first half of chapter 6, we read about how desperate and broken a place the world has already become. And in Genesis, God says he blesses Adam and Eve, and he tells them to be fruitful and to multiply. So the idea that they could have children, that they could be fruitful was a blessing. But by the time we get to Genesis 6, we read about how that blessing has become a curse. And as mankind has multiplied, so has the sin, the wrong that's happening in the world. And we read that there's sexual immorality, there are marriages that are against God's command, and there's basically a total disregard for the law that God had put in place for how mankind would live. And what we read in the Bible, and the King James Version of the Bible, says that grieved the heart of God. It grieved his heart to see what had happened to the world that he had created. And there's a man called Matthew Henry, who was quite a famous minister, who was born in the 1600s and wrote a very famous 6-volume commentary on the Bible. And he described that feeling of being grieved as a man, as you or I might be grieved when somebody that we've been really kind to turns their back on us. And that's kind of the situation here. God has given man life and has laid down some rules for how life should be lived, and actually mankind has spat in his face. So he decides that he needs to do something to give the world a fresh start, a clean start. But he doesn't want to punish those who are loyal to him, which is a pretty small group of people at this point. And we're going to read about that as we pick this up in Genesis 6, and we're going to read from verses 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you will enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of every living creature, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away for food for you and for them. And Noah did everything just as God commanded him. And I think for those of us that have maybe been Christians for a long time and maybe have heard this story many times before, there's a danger we can become almost desensitized to how big a message this is from God, both in terms of what he plans to do with the world and also what Noah's role is in that. And on the flip side, if you're new to church and maybe you've never heard that story before, you might be sat here this morning going, that's mental. You know, there's no way that could have happened. There's no way I can feasibly believe that something like this would have happened many generations ago. And this morning, I really want to focus on this idea of transition, so I don't want to spend loads of time kind of building a case for why the story about Noah might be valid. But I will just say this one thing, which is there's quite a famous man called Robert Ballard. And he's probably one of the most famous underwater archaeologists in the world today. And it was actually his team that discovered the remains of the Titanic in 1985. So he's a world-renowned underwater archaeologist. And he and his team, using all the technology available to us today, have conducted a lot of research into the validity of a claim like this, that there could have been something like this in the past. And as they conducted their research, they found when they were diving in the Black Sea off the coast of Turkey, they believe that they've found an ancient shoreline some 400 feet below the surface of the sea today that actually could back up the fact that, as Robert puts it, there could have been a mother of all floods at some point around this kind of time in history. So I'm not saying that is fundamental proof that this all happened, and I'm not going to get into that this morning, but all I want you to take from that is that Robert Ballard is one of the best in his field in the world today. He's not a Christian, to my understanding, and he believes that quite feasibly something like this could have happened around that time period in history. So I'll just leave that with you, and I just want, if you're finding it difficult to believe this might have happened, then just, and maybe that you would engage from what I'm going to say next as a result of that, I would just say suspend your disbelief just for this morning, because I really feel that this situation that Noah finds himself in is really poignant to where we are as a church and how he stays faithful through this incredible transition. So what do we know about Noah? Well, we know from this passage that he was a righteous man and he was blameless among the people of his time, and we know that he walked faithfully with God. So we know he's a good man. The word righteous literally means one who is right. So we know he's living in a way that God has called him to live. We know he's a family man. He's got 3 sons. So it seems that even in a terrible world full of evil and full of corruption, Noah has managed to build a good life. And it seems like he's been blessed by God because he has been faithful to what God has called him to. And I'm sure Noah, as a normal man, would have had plans and would have had things that he wanted to achieve in life as he went forward. And so this message from God about, first of all, what he was going to do to the world, but secondly, what Noah's role in that was going to be, would have hit him, I'm sure, like a ton of bricks. And I think that that's the case for 3 reasons. And firstly, what might not be immediately obvious is how huge a time commitment what he was calling Noah to was. This was going to take a huge amount of time. I mean, for context, God asked him to build this thing 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, which is roughly 450 by 75 by 45 feet. And to put that into context, that's longer than the football pitch at Wembley Stadium, and it's about the height of a 3-story house. So this thing was massive. Actually, in Kentucky in the USA, they've built a real-life, to-scale replica of the Ark, which I think we're going to see up on the screen now. I mean, that thing's huge, right? So this wasn't going to be a quick job. And for the record, this took 50 people and all of the technology we have available to us today, and a cost of about £1 million to build. So being as just Noah and his sons built the ark, biblical scholars believe that it probably took anywhere between 20 and 80 years to actually build this thing. So that's a massive time commitment. And a humongous spanner in any works or any plans that Noah might have had for the next 100 years or so of his life. And then they actually spend about a year on the boat itself. And also, the other thing to bear in mind is Noah was over 500 years old when God decides he's going to build that thing. So Noah could well have been thinking, this is going to finish me off. I'm not going to have any life left after I finish building that thing. So first of all, this massive inconvenience and massive time commitment in Noah's life would have been a shock. The second thing is Noah's a faithful man. So Noah's lived in the right way, he's done the right things, and God has blessed him as a result of that. And actually, if I'm Noah in this situation, then I'm thinking, so I've been good, I've done the right stuff, and actually now I've got to give the best part of 100 years of my life at least. I've got to give you about that much time in my sons' lives, and we believe probably again through what biblical scholars have analysed that his sons were anywhere from 16 to 30 years old at this point. So I've also got to give you somewhere between 20 and 100 years of my sons' lives as well, and also that you can deal with a bunch of evil people. So it would have felt to Noah like even though I've done the right thing, I still have to suffer because of the evil people in this world. And then thirdly, again, what might not be immediately obvious when we read through that, and if you've been a Christian for a long time and you've studied Noah in Sunday school and seen this beautiful image of the animals going on 2 by 2 onto the ark, we just need to consider the reality of that. That God actually says, what you're going to do is you're going to take all of your family and your children and their wives, you're going to put them on a boat, you're going to fill that boat with 2 types of every single animal out there. So that includes the smelly ones, that includes the gross ones, and frankly, that includes the downright dangerous ones. You're going to put them all on a boat, you're going to shut the door, and you're going to stay in there for about a year. Would you want to do that to your family? Would you want to put your family at risk like that? And that's before we even start to consider maybe the public ridicule as Noah starts to build this thing on his front lawn, or the economical side of this. I mean, how much did it cost to build a boat of that size? And I think if I was Noah, that would have hit me like a ton of bricks, and it would have left me with 2 questions. The first would be, why on earth is this fair that I have to do this? Why is it fair that my life has to be disrupted in this way in order to achieve what you want to achieve? And then the follow-on question to that would be, actually, if you are God, then surely you can do this a different way. Surely you can do this a way which means I don't actually have to give away this much time and have this much suffering and confusion. And I wonder if, when we consider kind of where we are as a church, and we're in this place where we're moving from A to B, and there's confusion and there's questions, and we're in that transition, I wonder how many of us have maybe uttered similar questions off the back of the news. How is this fair? How is it fair that, I'm really comfortable here and I like it here and now I've got to move? How is that fair? And God, if you are really God and if you're really blessing this church and if you really want what's best for us, surely you can find a different way to do it. That means we can stay right here where we're happy and where we're settled. And we don't really get any indication from the text about what Noah's reaction initially was to what God says. The Bible doesn't really fill us in on that, but he's a human man with a family to look after. So I think we can pretty safely say he'd have had some questions, he'd have had some concerns, and he would have had a heck of a lot of confusion, I'm sure, off the back of that. But what we do know about Noah is that regardless of what that initial reaction, how this affects me, how this disrupts my life, how this inconveniences me, whatever his initial reaction was, he gets over it pretty quickly. And he gets on with what God has asked him to do, and he does everything as God had commanded him. He remains faithful to what God is calling him to do, even in the midst of the most inconvenient and confusing transition. So how was he able to do that? I think is the sensible question. How did he get himself into a place where he could do that? And for me, the key comes in verse 9 of this passage, where it says that Noah walked faithfully with God. It's a simple sentence in some ways, but Noah walks faithfully with God. And I mentioned earlier that faithfulness means to be loyal and to be devoted and to be committed. But actually, in the Old Testament, God's faithfulness to his people is very closely linked to God's constant love of his people. So in other words, God is faithful to us because he constantly loves us. And there's no better explanation for his faithfulness than the fact he constantly loves us, even despite our huge imperfection. So in the same vein, if we are to be faithful to God, and if we are to show true faithfulness, then that means we must choose to constantly love God, regardless of what might be going on around us. And I think this is the real crux of why Noah was able to do what he was able to do, and why he was able to make that decision. It's because in spite of everything that was going on, and in spite of the discomfort and the confusion, he chooses to constantly love God in that moment. He actually has to choose that. He has to choose, I'm going to love you, and therefore I'm going to be faithful to what it is you're calling me to do, regardless of what I can kind of see around me. And I think for me, the impressive thing about Noah is that he's not looking backwards. He's not looking at this great life that God has allowed him to have up to this point, the blessing that's been poured on him. And in some ways, we could do the same thing. We could look at what we've got today, and we could say, God, we're in this great place where you've blessed us so much. Noah's not looking at that. And he's also not really in a position where he can look forward with any real clarity, because how do you do that when God tells you something like this? How can you build a picture in your human mind of actually what God's going to do, flooding the entire earth? And actually, up until this point in Genesis, there's no mention of rain at all. So this could actually be the first time Noah had ever witnessed rain when it started to come. So he's not in a position to really see forward with any clarity, and he's not looking back at the comfortable life he has, but instead he's in that place of transition, and he's just choosing, I'm going to be constant to you, God. I'm going to constantly love you, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to be faithful, trusting that you have the answer. And because of that, he ends up precisely where God wants him. And we read as we move through Genesis that he and his family board the ark, and for 40 days and for 40 nights the waters come. And then for the best part of another year they remain locked on the ark until the waters have dried up. And then they leave, and they leave into blessing, where they then repopulate the rest of the earth from that small group of faithful people. And for me, one of the big questions is, where on earth would they have ended up if Noah hadn't been faithful? Where would he and his family have ended up? Maybe they'd have been okay. Maybe they'd have ended up roughly in the right kind of direction. Who knows? But because they were faithful in that transition period, they ended up precisely where God wanted to be and in the center of his blessing. So what can we take from all of this morning? Well, in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, the writer wisely notes that there is a season and a purpose for everything under the sun. And that includes transition. Whether we like it or not, transition will come in our lives. Transition will definitely come again in the life of this church as well. But I think it's important that we know there's not just a timing for transition, but there's actually a purpose in it as well. A purpose in those times of confusion. And Noah was arguably in the biggest transition this world has ever seen. And I think his response to that is impressive and poignant, because he doesn't just coast through it. He doesn't just kind of remain unemotional to it or passive to it. But he's in there and he's attentive to the word of God, and he's obedient to the command that comes off the back of it. And because of that, he ends up exactly in the right place. And how relevant is that right now for us as a church? That we are constant, that we are faithful, and that we're attentive to the word of God whilst we're in this period of slight confusion. There's an interesting imagery in Noah and the ark as well, in that Noah was asked to build this thing, this place of sanctuary, if you like. But he wasn't asked to just jump on himself and make sure that he was comfortable and he was happy. He took his family with him, and they put all the animals on there as well, and they filled it to the max before they closed the doors. And in some ways, we could think of this church as the ark, and we could think of it as our comfortable little place that's safe. But actually, there's a calling on us to fill this place to the brim. And when it's full like it is now, we have to make it bigger so we can continue to fill it to the brim. And that's really the challenge of where we are now as a church. That's the reason we're in this place, is we want to be in a position where we can grow and where there is room for growth and room for God's kingdom to expand. And you might think this morning that you have no role in that. You might think actually it's down to the leadership team to figure this stuff out and to decide where we're going to be and where we're going to meet and how that's going to look. But we know from the Bible teaches us that we are all sons and daughters of God. We're all a family. We're in this together, whether you like it or not. We're in this together. And actually, I know I speak for the whole of the leadership team when I say that what we would love is for you to partner with us in this time of transition, to partner with us in prayer, but also to partner with us in this vision. Because we don't just want to make life difficult for the sake of making life difficult. We want to be in a place where God can grow his kingdom. And that's where all of this comes from. And I know that many of you are already in that place where you're partnering with us and you're behind this vision. But if you're not, and if deep down you're unhappy about the decision, and you're confused, and you're upset, and you're disappointed, then I just want to challenge you with this morning. If you stay in that place right now when we're in transition, maybe a place of bitterness or of disappointment or of sadness or of frustration, if you stay in that place right now, then where are you going to be when we get to the new destination, whatever that looks like? Are you going to be in the best place in terms of your relationship with God? And are you going to be in the best mindset at that point to grow God's kingdom, which is the calling on every single one of our lives? How well aligned are you going to be to that if right now in this period of transition you are bitter and you are disappointed and you are frustrated? Because whether we like it or not, what we do in transition affects what happens afterwards. And I really believe God was testing Noah through the request to build the ark. I believe he wanted to know how far Noah would go with him, how far he would go and still remain faithful and still remain constant. Of course, God could have done it differently. He's God. He could have clicked his fingers and changed the whole world. And in the same way, rather than maybe having some of this confusion and uncertainty now in Living Well Church, God could click his fingers, give us 6 million quid, and we go and build an amazing church down the road. Maybe he'll still do that. But there are times when we just have to show that we are faithful, and we have to answer the calling of God, and we have to prove that we will constantly choose to love him, even in those times of trial and change. This church has had to do that in the past, and God has always blessed us every time we've stepped out like that. And I believe wholeheartedly he's going to do that again today. So I'll finish with this. I'm going to go back to my golfing analogy for a moment. And as my coach was trying to get me to adjust a few things in my swing, because before I took a single golf lesson, I could walk up to a golf ball and hoof it roughly in the right direction, like I discussed before. But there were things that I was doing wrong, and he wanted to change that. So I needed to change my stance, my swing needed to change. There were a few things that I had to alter in my body movement. And as a result of some of these changes, at first I actually started hitting the ball worse than I was when I was doing it all wrong. And I found that really frustrating. I was like, the ball's not going as far now as it was when I was just walking up and smacking it. And he said something else that, again, I don't think Gary at Stoneleys Golf Club realises how profound he is in what he says. But he said to me, he said, the really important thing right now is that you don't judge the success of your swing based on what you see with your eyes. He said, because if you judge it by how far it goes down there, you're not going to get a true view of what's happening in that transition period. He said, the thing you've got to judge the success of your golfing on right now is how you feel in the transition. Not what you see with your eyes, but how you feel in the transition. And again, I think that's really poignant for us as a church, because we shouldn't judge the success of where we are right now as a church based on what we see with our eyes. Based on the fact we know December's coming, and we can't see a new building yet, and the days are just ticking down, we can't judge the success of where we are right now based on what we see. But what we can judge it on, we can judge the success of this church, and we can judge our own faithfulness by how we feel right now in this transition period. Do we still love God? Do we still trust him? Do we still believe he's faithful to us? Because if we do, it's going to be fine. Because God's love is constant and his faithfulness to his people is constant. And if in that we're still struggling, if in that we still can't get past how this affects me and how this inconveniences me and how this worries me, then maybe we just need to take a leaf out of Noah's book this morning. And maybe we need to get over it. Just get over it, get on with it, and continue to follow in the way that God is commanding us. And if we do that, then I guarantee we will end up in the perfect place that God has for us as a church.